everyone! In this video, we are going to be looking at the poem When We Two Parted by Lord Byron. Before we jump into the poem, here's a couple of highlights from Lord Byron's life. Byron was born in the year 1788 in London, and he died in 1824. He was one of the big six romantic poets, with the other ones being Wordsworth, Keats, Blake, Coleridge, and Shelley, whom he was friends with. Byron was born with a deformed foot, which he was incredibly self-conscious about throughout his life. He travelled around the Mediterranean after racking up lots of debt in his early 20s, and he especially took to Greece. He returned to England after 3 years of travelling, but would later on move to Italy, where he met Percy Shelley. But he'd eventually settle in Greece. Byron was bisexual, and his turbulent personal life and sexual liaisons are well documented. His wife even accused him of incest, sodomy, and all sorts of infidelities. But all controversies aside, Byron was also well known for being a champion of social causes, and was an outspoken member at the House of Lords. He'd eventually be involved in the Greek War of Independence, during which he died of fever at the age of 36. I will now read the poem, but if you wish to do that yourself, you can click pause and return to the video once you're done. When we two parted in silence and tears, half broken-hearted to sever for years, pale grew thy cheek and cold, colder thy kiss. Truly that hour foretold sorrow to this. The dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow. It felt like the warning of what I feel now. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy fame. I hear thy name spoken, and share in its shame. They name thee before me, a knell to mine ear. A shudder comes over me, why wert thou so dear? They know not I knew thee who knew thee too well. Long, long shall I rue thee, too deeply to tell. In secret we met, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee? With silence and tears. Now, given Byron's wild romantic history, it's really hard not to read his love poetry in the light of his own relationships. Indeed, scholars have suggested that Byron wrote When We Two Parted after he found out that one of his flings at the time, Lady Frances Webster, was having an affair with the Duke of Wellington. So much for breaking hearts left, right and centre. Byron was finally given a taste of his own medicine. So the result of his apparent heartbreak over Lady Frances is the bane of many English literature students today, aka studying the poem When We Two Parted. On the surface, the poem seems to be about the disappointment and grief one feels about a failed romance, which is something that most people can identify with. But as I will go on to show in my analysis, there is more to it than meets the eye. So let's start with the title of the poem. From the phrase "we two," we feel a strong sense of division, and this suggests two separate individuals instead of one couple. The past tense of parted emphasises that the relationship took place in the past, and that whatever amorous feelings may remain, there's no longer a relationship to speak of. Now, the syntax in the opening stanza gives us a first glimpse into the speaker's thoughts. Right after line 4, to sever for years, notice the word order of pale grew thy cheek and cold, colder thy kiss. This may sound odd because it reverses the normal subject-verb-object sentence construction, in which case it would read something like, thy cheek grew pale and cold, thy kiss colder. This is an example of hyperbaton, and this syntactical inversion could reflect the speaker's change in perspective and attitude towards his lover. Note as well the pair of caesura that bookends line 5, coming after the words years and cold. This echoes the idea of severing and implies that the lover's coldness is the reason for the breakdown of this relationship. On the whole, the poem follows an alternate rhyme scheme, but there's a couple of areas I'd like to highlight. Notice that when we get to stanza 3, there are 2 repeated rhyming pairs. Me and me in lines 17 and 19, thee and thee in lines 21 and 23. What's interesting is that both the me and thee rhyming pairs are chiastically arranged with mine in line 18 and another thee in line 22. So what does this suggest? We see once again this idea of a clear distinction between 2 individuals. Here, the me of the speaker and thee of his lover are placed in clear parallel juxtaposition. Parallel lines, as we know, never cross each other. And so perhaps the idea here is that the speaker and his lover are never to cross each other's paths ever again. The rhetorical question in line 20, why wert thou so dear, functions here as a sort of axis of symmetry between the group of me's and thees, suggesting that while the speaker and his lover were once so alike in their love, they are now divided and broken up into 2. The speaker's desire to dissociate himself from his lover makes sense, because we know from lines 15 to 16 in stanza 2 that her name comes with shame, which is indicated by the internal rhyme. Moving on to rhythm, which is an important part of this poem's analysis. When we two parted is an example of accentual verse. This means each line contains the same number of stresses regardless of the number of syllables. Much of English poetry is accentual verse, largely because English is a stress-timed language, unlike Italian or French, which are syllable-timed. But going back to this poem, so much is happening in just the first stanza itself. The first 4 lines alternate between dactylic and anapestic dimeter. But in the latter half of the stanza, the rhythmic composition shifts to all dactyls. What do I mean by this? Let's take a look at a marked up version of the stanza. A dactylic foot refers to a stress-unstress-unstress unit. So if we read line 1, it goes, when we two parted, which is dactylic. An anapestic foot, on the other hand, refers to an unstress-unstress-stress unit. So if we read line 2, it goes, in silence and tears, which fits the bill for an anapest. So what can we make of this to and fro between dactyls and anapests in the first half? And what about the latter half, which becomes entirely dactylic? Well, we see that the speaker starts off by feeling a bit ambivalent, almost wistful in his lament to the loss of this relationship. This uncertainty is reflected in the wishy-washiness of the rhythm, as it shifts between the stresses and unstresses at the beginning. Right after his reference to 7 years though, his words, as does the rhythm, becomes more resolute in its decision to cut ties. And so the rhythm becomes more trenchant with the dactylic momentum, as the speaker places the blame of this breakup on his lover. Interestingly, after the dactyls in stanza 1, the rest of the poem's rhythm is largely anapestic. These anapests project a sense of predictability, almost as if the speaker is suggesting that he's seen it coming for a while. This echoes the foreboding reference to "it felt like the warning" in line 11. So after stanza 1, we see that the speaker's lament seems less like a genuine emotional outpour of grief, and more so a crafted testimony of one who is supposed to feel grief, You feel that merry-go-round sort of swing when there's too many anapests, and after a while it gets a bit monotonous. Just one more point to make before we move on from rhythm. Note that while stanzas 2 and 3 alternate between feminine and masculine endings, stanza 4 only contains masculine line endings. All of its lines end on a stress. This tells us that the speaker has progressed from being of two minds about letting this doomed relationship go to finally deciding that he's going to cut everything off once and for all. Now moving on to the imagery of the poem. There are two particularly interesting sets of imagery at play. First, there's the visual imagery of the droplet in dew of the morning and the tears in silence and tears. Next, there's the sonic imagery of a deafening silence in the reference to a knell to mine ear, and again in the thrice repeated word silence, which repeats twice in the phrase silence and tears, first seen in line 2 of the poem. While the morning dew is a biblical allusion, symbolizing truth and virtue, the heartbroken tears are a result of deceit and unvirtuous behavior. And this, by the way, could be said for both the lover and the speaker, given the secretive nature of their affair. So Byron also repurposes the dew from being a symbol of truth to an omen of betrayal. As in line 10, it sunk chill on my brow and verified his suspicions. The knell is a bell that one would find at a funeral and is a symbol of death. As an object one would find in a sacred space like the church, the knell gives this illicit relationship a veneer of holiness, and so to an extent seems to justify it from the speaker's perspective. The alliteration of sibilants in the final stanza reinforces the idea of silence, but when we read the words secret, silent, spirit, deceive, and should in close succession, the overall result actually isn't all that quiet. So, ironically then, we're led to consider if the speaker really is grieving in silence, because if he were, then there probably wouldn't even be this poem and its many words to begin with. My final point is about verb tenses. Notice that there's a couple of tense shifts throughout the poem, including felt to feel in stanza 2, know to knew in stanza 3, and met to meet in stanza 4. This is an example of polyptoton, which means the repetition of the same root but in different forms of the word. By differentiating what is past from what is present, Byron highlights the speaker's wish to dissociate himself from a shameful underground relationship. For instance, why does the speaker say knew thee instead of know? Apart from the possible wordplay on knew as a biblical word for sex, the fact that this verb comes in simple past tense suggests that the lover he once knew is different from the betrayer he now knows. This is similar to the rhetorical question in line 20, why wert thou so dear? The word wert is the archaic form of were, which is the past tense of are. This implies that the lover was once dear to the speaker, but not anymore. In the penultimate line, the modal auxiliary should, in how should I greet thee, conveys a sense of grudging obligation, as if suggesting that any future encounter between the speaker and the lover will only be a matter of courtesy and goodwill, rather than one of intimacy or affection. And that's it for this analysis, guys. If you find this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to this channel for other GCSE and A-level English literature videos. I have a blog post comparing this poem with Percy Bysshe Shelley's Love's Philosophy, which you can check out in the description box below. Please leave a comment to let me know what you're studying and what else you wish to see from this channel. See you soon!